Alrighty, folks, it is now March. It's already March after the world's longest January. It's now March, and we're still going through the world's longest DoD Inspector General report about the DoD's process for authorizing official C3PAOs to perform CMMC third-party assessments. This is part 3 of 4, going through every single detail in the IG report that people have been touting as the thing that will sink CMMC among the long list of things that have been said will sink CMMC. Today, we're talking about the last 2 findings that the IG found, what they recommended, and they are specific to what the DIBCAC DoD auditors found or didn't find during the process. That's what we're going to talk about today.
We've been doing this for a long time, and what I'm hoping is par for the course in a Jacob story or a build-up story is that it builds up and it ultimately climaxes at some point where we, see some of the thrilling things that everybody was looking for when we're like, hey, maybe we should dig deeper into this report. Up until now, I'm going to be honest with you, buddy, I don't see it.
I think most people would find if they listen to the previous 2 episodes, which we'll link below, we have yet to see the smoking gun in the report. So maybe these last 2 things, they save the best for last. Maybe these 2 things that they talk about in this part of the report will be the thing that everybody was hyping up as the problem. But let's dive into it and figure out what's going on. So all the background information for those of you who missed the first 2 episodes, go ahead and check those out. But if you're just tuning in for the first time, DoD contractors that maintain controlled unclassified information that is critical to national security must undergo CMMC Level 2 assessments performed by an authorized CMMC third-party assessment organization known as a C3PAO. In November of 2020, the DoD issued a no-cost contract to the CMMC accreditation body, often referred to as the Cyber AB nowadays. And they did this to manage the C3PAO authorization process and to ensure that candidate C3PAOs meet the requirements to become full-fledged C3PAOs in the ecosystem. These candidate C3PAOs must successfully complete a series of 12 requirements before they can be authorized to perform CMMC Level 2 third-party assessments. The DoD Inspector General, otherwise known as the DoD IG, sought to determine whether the DoD ensured that process for authorizing these third-party organizations to perform these assessments was effectively implemented. So we're talking about those 12 steps that a company has to go through in order to become a C3PAO. In order to do this, the IG reviewed the application packages of 11 of the 48 C3PAOs that the Cyber AB had previously authorized to perform these assessments. That was as of September of 2023. And they observed 3 of the CMMC Level 2 assessments conducted by DIBCAC auditors, DoD's internal auditors. So all these companies have to go through an assessment. That assessment's conducted by DIBCAC. And so they observed 3 of those assessments conducted by DIBCAC. Overall, the IG made 10 recommendations. Today, we're talking about the last 2 recommendations, what they recommended specifically with regards to what happened in the DIBCAC assessments. And then in part 4, coming up in the future, we're going to cover the allegations that were submitted to the IG by people who heard about this analysis as it was ongoing, and our closing thoughts on the quality of the report and whether this was all worth spending 4 weeks talking about. Okay, let's talk about this authorization process, this 12-step process. So 3 different organizations have responsibilities associated with the C3PAO authorization process. The Cyber Accreditation Body, the Cyber AB, the CMMC Program Management Office, known as the CMMC PMO, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, known as DIBCAC. It's fun bar trivia. Most people don't know what the DIBCAC acronym stands for, so make sure you write that one down, everybody, because it's good stump the chump question. Okay, the Cyber AB is responsible for most of these steps. They're responsible for 10 of the 12 steps. They have to talk about overseeing the submission of the C3PAO application package. The application fees are paid, passing organizational background checks that are run by the Cyber AB, pass foreign ownership control and influence reviews, participate in interviews with the cyber AB, signing C3PAO agreements and codes of professional conduct, which is one of the items that generated recommendations we talked about in the previous episode, paying activation fees, providing verification of insurance, implementing assessment appeals processes that are approved by the cyber AB, and employing or awarding contracts to CMMC certified assessors and CMMC quality control leads, another source of recommendations that we talked about in the previous episodes. The CMMC PMO, headed up by Stacy Bostjanek and all of her colleagues, perform separate organizational background checks to assess candidate C3PAO's operational risks. That's basically the only thing they do as far as this process goes. And then DIBCAC. DIBCAC is responsible for the 12th and final step, the CMMC Level 2 assessments of candidate C3PAOs, as the DoD requires that candidate C3PAOs undergo the same assessment that they will be responsible for performing once they are authorized. And so the IG report had findings in the signed agreements and codes of professional conduct, the employment or contract employment of certified assessors and quality leads, and allegedly the DIBCAC assessments themselves. So the IG identified deficiencies concerning the successful completion of 3 of those, like I said, which supports the need for this overall quality assurance process that we've talked about before. And in order to fill out the details, they made 10 recommendations, 3 for the DoD CIO, the CMMC PMO, 5 for the AB, those were the previous 2 episodes, and then 2 just for DIBCAC. So very quickly, findings can have certain statuses. 5 of the recommendations are unresolved, which means that the management, the people that it's relevant to, DIBCAC, the PMO, whoever, have not agreed to implement the recommendation or have not proposed actions that will address the recommendation. It would be unresolved. 4 of the recommendations, 4 of the 10 recommendations are resolved, which means they have agreed to implement the recommendation or propose some action that will address the recommendation. And one of those recommendations is closed, which means that the IG verified that everything is good to go. So closed and resolved means it's taken care of. Unresolved means there's still some issue. And as we learned about in the previous 2 episodes, unresolved doesn't necessarily mean that the people who have things to do haven't done anything. It just means that the IG doesn't necessarily agree with the actions that are to be taken. And sometimes the IG will make recommendations that are literally impossible for management to do anything about, as we're going to find out very quickly here when we talk about what they told DIBCAC to do.
Yeah, I think it's a true difference of opinion, but just quickly to summarize like everything that we just went over and to narrow down kind of what we're going to be talking about today, it's in the 12-step process to authorize C3PAOs. There were recommendations for DIBCAC that was specifically made in the audit, right? Well, we know that DIBCAC's only role within this entire process is to do what? Assess the C3PAOs against their security standard. So realistically, all the findings are going to be based on the assessment. So now we have the DoD IG arguing with assessors that have been hired, vetted, and have, skill and I guess experience in this, right? Arguing out a difference of opinion for the most part when it comes to that.
Yeah, so let's see what happens when we put them in the cage together and they are both going through the assessment, the conducting of an assessment, and see what happens. Okay, so like we said, last 2 recommendations, everybody, we're almost done here. Just to sum up what we're about to say, the DoD IG wants Stacy Bostjanek's team to revise a requirement in the CMMC assessment guide because DIBCAC got a requirement wrong, even though NIST controls are only revised by NIST, and implementing that recommendation would require an entire rulemaking process. Do the math. And then in addition to that, the IG wants DIBCAC to retest every single C3PAO for a 1-point requirement that the IG misunderstood in the context of the assessment, even though there was not a single other issue that they identified in the way that DIBCAC conducted their assessments. So we'll explain how we got to those 2 bullet points, but that's essentially what this entire part, this 10 pages of stuff is going to say.
So you're saying they misunderstood one of the requirements and now they want the C3PA to do the work to assess the requirement
Yeah. So, the DoD IG, and they don't say this until the bottom of the last page of the report that they misunderstood what was going on. But you wouldn't know that if you read the other pages of the report because they go on and on and on about how it was a problem. Anyways, let's see what they have to say about this, right? So, the IG found that for 3 of the candidate C3PAO CMMC Level 2 assessments that the IG observed, remember they observed 3 assessments, the DIBCAC assessors generally verified that the candidate C3PAOs implemented the required 110 requirements in NIST Special Publication 800-171, except for one requirement related to user and group account access for 2 of the candidate C3PAOs. So in 2 of these 3, one of the requirements was at issue. That's pretty good. That's pretty good in the sense that 109 of the other requirements had no issues whatsoever across 3 different assessments. That's pretty good. I don't even know what the details are yet, but off the top, that's not too bad. Okay, so as a result, the IG had 2 recommendations: one for the PMO, one for Stacy Boschanic and her team, and one for DIBCAC directly related to assessments. So they said that the CMMC PMO should revise the CMMC assessment guides to further define the requirement for disabling inactive accounts to include group accounts. And they list this as an unresolved recommendation, which means it hasn't been met. The other recommendation is that the DIBCAC director should require DIBCAC assessors to retest that requirement for disabling user and group accounts after a defined period of inactivity for every single C3PAO that went through an assessment and was previously authorized. And they say that this is currently also unresolved. So, yeah.
Why?
Okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the second one first.
Like, why are they so far right field, right? Like, why does it have to be complete rulemaking?
Well, it must have been egregious. It must have been an egregious oversight.
Yeah, it has to be, right?
For them to be like, everybody stop what you're doing, retest all 50 C3PAOs on this one requirement. They must have absolutely, completely fumbled the ball on this one requirement, right, everybody? Let's talk about the second one first, and then we'll dive into the details of the first one. So,
okay.
The DIBCAC director should require these assessors to retest the requirement for disabling user and group accounts after a defined period of inactivity for every single previously authorized C3PAO. They say that this recommendation is unresolved because comments from the DIBCAC deputy director only partially addressed the recommendations. According to the DIBCAC deputy director, DIBCAC will review 25% of the C3PAO Level 2 assessments conducted in the previous 2 years, and they'll take appropriate actions as a result. In addition, they will send an email to the entire DIBCAC organization on testing the requirement for disabling user and group accounts after a defined period of inactivity, and provide additional follow-on training in DIBCAC's bi-weekly training sessions. And the training team will evaluate its existing assessor training course to reiterate that identifiers include specific entities, objects, and groups, regardless of whether they are identified in the SSP or observed during the assessment. That's a pretty comprehensive answer. If you ask me, they're like, hey, we're going to go back and we're going to spot check the previous assessments. We're going to up the training that we do twice a week to include this specific issue. And we're going to make sure all new training for new assessors emphasizes this point. That sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, and it's also like seeing if it's a one-off or if it's a consistent problem, right? If we're doing the spot check and it's appearing in a good percentage of 25%, then yeah, obviously this is a systemic problem, right? But realistically, if you spot check and none of them show up, you're still going to do some training based on their recommendations. But again, the argument that I have is, didn't you say this was an IG misinterpretation of the control?
We'll get there. The IG's response to this proposed solution, remember, this is an unresolved finding. And so this is what DIBCAC proposes as closing this finding. And they say, no. Unresolved. 25% is not sufficient. You need to do more. Let us know if you're going to do more. DIBCAC says 25% is enough, and we'll go from there. IG says 25% is not enough, therefore unresolved. And so you look through and you're like, oh my God, DIBCAC's not doing anything. Well, they're obviously doing quite a bit to solve this problem. Sounds to me like that's enough to solve the problem.
Me too.
And based off what you said, sounds like enough to know, do we need to do more if we start to find this to be an issue? But what do you guys think hearing this finding and recommendation. Do you think 25% and then beefing up the training on this one finding would be enough? Or should they have to go back by default and retest every single person? Remember, only thing that they found an issue with. No other issues were found. And they didn't even find it in all 3 of the assessments. The IG specifically said, because DIBCAC assessors did not consistently define or apply the requirement to disable or remove user and group accounts after a defined period, we identified at least one C3PAO that should have failed the level 2 assessment because of that inconsistency. And we're not going to editorialize our thoughts in this episode. However, the requirement they're talking about is requirement 3.5.5, prevent reuse of identifiers for a defined period. This is a 1-point control. And as far as I can tell from everybody that I've talked to who went through their assessments as a C3PAO during this period, these were not pass-fail assessments. If you had onesie-twosie findings, then you had some period to remediate what was going on in order to go through and get your authorization. They don't list what the requirement is. They don't list what the verification criteria are in 171A. They don't say that there was a remediation period that would have been allowed to have them close this issue. They just say that the company would have failed and never would have become a C3PAO, which to me is not true. That is not actually painting an accurate picture of what was going on here.
Yeah, they didn't get...
They didn't say that DIBCAC misinterpreted half of the requirements and that we have no idea if the company was able to actually implement it or not. They said they messed up on one.
But it's still because DIBCAC assessors did not consistently define.
Well, that's a good point. Let's talk about, was it DIBCAC's misinterpretation or was it actually the IG misinterpreting what the interpretation was? So remember, DIBCAC's like, all right, fine. We'll up the training. We'll clarify what's going on. We'll go back and retest, 1 in every 4 of the requirement of the assessments that we did to make sure. And IG's like, nope, not sufficient, unresolved. Let's talk about what the actual nature of the problem was. So the IG says the PMO, the CMMC PMO, Stacey Bosch-Janik and her team, should revise the CMMC assessment guides to further define the requirement for disabling inactive accounts to include group accounts. First of all, you can't do that. NIST does that. We already tried this under CMMC 1.0. You remember DoD IG, you wrote the report that led to CMMC 1.0. You guys were there. Also, it would require rulemaking. I know that's not something that the DoD IG has to worry about, but you can't just revise things that are written in regulations. Sorry, guys. Anyways, the recommendation is unresolved because the acting DoD CIO at the time, which is now Katie Arrington, which we're going to talk about in a future episode as soon as we get done with this freaking crazy long IG report, the acting DoD CIO responding for Stacey's team did not address the specifics of the recommendation. According to the then acting DoD CIO, Leslie Beavers, they said there is no need for additional action because the requirement in NIST SP 800-171 states that disabling identifiers includes specific entities, objects, or groups. That's true. That's what it says whenever you look at the requirement, whenever you read the discussion section about the requirement. They also say that the CMMC assessment guides align with the NIST guidance, which they 100% do. That was the entire point of going from 1.0 to 2.0 was strict alignment to the wording in 171 and 171A. So there is no need to revise the requirement, right, IG? Well, the IG has a response. They said, we agree that the CMMC assessment guides align with 171 requirements to disable or remove user and group accounts after a defined period of inactivity. However, the DIBCAC assessors did not consistently define or apply the requirement when conducting CMMC level 2 assessments. So it's not actually a problem with the document, is it? It's a problem with DIBCAC's interpretation. So why are we rewriting the requirement rather than talking about training as the recommendation, IG? Interesting. All right. So they say that further defining the requirement for disabling these accounts, including group accounts, should reduce the risk that DIBCAC assessors conclude that a candidate C3PAO met the requirement when they actually did not. Okay. Rather than training to the requirement that is aligned to what NIST has written, which includes the thing you're talking about, we want to change the wording of the requirement. And they say, had the DIBCAC assessors properly applied the NIST SP 800-171 requirement, both candidate C3PAOs would have failed their level 2 assessment. I don't necessarily think that's true. So let's talk about what happened in both of these situations. They say for one C3PAO, DIBCAC assessors incorrectly determined that an assessment of the user and group accounts was not necessary because the C3PAO's process for implementing the requirement did not define a period of inactivity after which the inactive accounts would be disabled. This is a problem. That is the first step in verifying 3.5.5. A period within which identifiers cannot be reused is defined. If you don't have that, you don't meet the requirement. So the IG is correct here. DIBCAC says they met the intent of the requirement because the company only employed 2 individuals and therefore would not likely need to disable either account. That is not a sufficient answer. DIBCAC got it wrong. The IG got it right. They did not meet 3.5.5A in NIST SP 800-171A. They go on to say that the requirement is not contingent on the number of individuals employed in an organization, and at any time the company could expand and hire additional employees. That's correct.
Which is correct.
And they say the deputy director of DIBCAC agreed with the IG that the candidate C3PAO did not define the period after which the account should be disabled and that the requirement should have been scored as not met. So we're in agreement. We're in agreement here. So yeah, DIBCAC didn't get this one correct. But like I said before, this was not a binary pass-fail assessment at the time. There was a period of time where they would allow for remediation. And as far as we can tell from what the IG said, that was the only thing that they messed up in the assessment. So 319 of the 320 assessment objectives were perfectly fine. And this one was interpreted incorrectly. DIBCAC director agrees. IG says unresolved. Well, what happened with the second one? Was this also DIBCAC misinterpreting what's going on? Is this a consistent pattern that it's the DIBCAC assessor's fault? They say for the, what's up?
The first one, it's like a lack of documentation, but there was documentation, and you have to see the documentation, because if they defined like how they didn't define that things weren't disabled at all, like, yeah, that's a huge problem. If they say, but if Tom dies, that's it, or if Mary dies, then that's it, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, could it be interpretation of they didn't define the period of if Tom dies, his account has to be disabled within 30 days? That's the details that I want to know. And sometimes the devil is in the details, but I'm in agreement with you and the IG that yes, I do think that
it sounds like they messed that
still
one up.
Wouldn't have failed the assessment, but there would have been a finding.
Correct. Yeah, there would have been a finding. And I think honestly, I was expecting there to be a lot more than one of 320 of the assessment objectives was interpreted incorrectly, because we've heard a lot of crazy stories about DIBCAC assessments.
For a finding in an IG report, you would think that it was more than, I don't know.
I would have thought for sure there would have been more. The fact that they only had an issue with one is incredible to me. But they are correct. In this situation, DIBCAC messed it up. So do we have 2 points in which we can draw a line to say DIBCAC is misinterpreting this specific requirement, change the requirement, do more training, check everybody? Let's find out. So for the other C3PAO, DIBCAC incorrectly determined that the use of group accounts was a prohibited practice and did not need to be assessed. They said that the C3PAO's process for implementing the requirement only covered user accounts and not group accounts, which is specified in the requirement. And they say, however, neither NIST SP 800-171 nor DoD guidance prohibits organizations from using group accounts. So this DIBCAC idea that group accounts wouldn't be allowed is not sufficient. It says it in the requirement. The guidance doesn't say you can't. So if you don't look for it, then it just goes uncontrolled and unchecked. Well, the deputy director of DIBCAC disagreed with the IG. They said that candidate C3PAO should have been scored as not met because the candidate C3PAO's cloud environment does not allow group accounts. Therefore, they did not need a process for disabling group accounts. So marking this as not met would be incorrect. The deputy director stated that no group accounts were observed by the DIBCAC team or the DoD IG audit team during the assessment of this C3PAO. And they say that the reason that it's not possible is because of the way that the licensing works for the seats and the users in this cloud environment. They necessarily cannot be using group accounts. They literally can't use the group account. So there is no process for limiting group accounts. They cannot exist. And as we talked about before, the basis for a requirement being not applicable is if the basis for the control exists or not. You don't have to have a process for controlling Wi-Fi if there's no Wi-Fi in the environment. You don't have to install the Wi-Fi in order to control it, right?
But it's not the whole control being marked not applicable. It's only an element of one microsegment of the control. So
Correct.
realistically, it would have to be defined that our cloud service provider XYZ does not prohibit the use of group accounts.
Correct. So DIBCAC is like, you don't understand. They cannot do that in this environment. So we're not going to look for it. There was no reason for them to have it. Saying that they would be not met is incorrect. Well, the IG comes back and says, and this is at the very end, this is page 25, right? The very, very end.
Slide it in at the end.
And they say the information provided by the deputy director about the candidate C3PAO's cloud environment was not shared with us during the audit. We didn't know. And they say specifically, the deputy director stated that while the creation of group accounts, an account with shared credentials, is possible in a cloud environment, doing so would violate the terms of service by licensed user seats established by the agreement with the cloud service provider. They say the deputy director did not provide supporting documentation that would allow us to verify that creating group accounts is not allowed. Therefore, we didn't revise any of the language on pages 9 through 14 of this report. They left the language exactly the same, and you wouldn't know that there was this disagreement on the IG's part in terms of understanding how licensing and group account works in cloud environments unless you read the last line at the bottom of page 25 after you read through their long description of how DIBCAC was messing everything up and how the recommendations stemming from DIBCAC messing up were unresolved and management still needed to do things. As it turns out, we don't have two situations where DIBCAC was consistently misinterpreting items in 171A for requirement 3.5.5. We have a situation where the IG doesn't know how cloud licensing works, and another situation where DIBCAC misinterpreted what was going on in extremely small environments. But for some reason, we got unresolved recommendations for doing something that would trigger an entire rulemaking cycle, and apparently just training people on what needs to happen here is not sufficient in the eyes of the IG, which I find to be very convenient for the IG.
I think it's very convenient, but they need to come. We often say, like, when you make comments on rules and things like that, like, it has to be constructive comments, right? Or things that are kind of realistic in nature. How are you going to make unrealistic recommendations, like revise a NIST document to revise an entire, framework? Or so
I think
reassessment of the entire
doing training on this cloud group issue is a great thing to do on regular training, because you're going to see that in cloud-based enclave solutions all the time. And this is a thing that we've seen in the past for this requirement. And this is how to interpret it. This is why we don't worry about group accounts in those situations. They're probably not going to have a process for it because it would violate their terms of service. They're not going to do it.
I feel bad for the poor C3PO that DIBCAC comes knocking. They're like, hey, you're one of the 25%. Hey, we might have messed up. You might not have gotten this certification. So
zooming out, we went way down in the weeds here. Does anybody see the smoking gun here on the CMMC program?
Oh, that's
because this is these are the last two recommendations based off of the IG misinterpreting how the cloud works, based off of DIBCAC messing up one of 320 assessment objectives in one of their environments. And that was pretty much it. DIBCAC wants to do more training. They want to beef everybody up. They want to go back and spot check everybody, 25% of their previously authorized C3PAOs. And let me keep scrolling here. Yeah, I don't know. Where is the smoking gun, everybody on LinkedIn who posted about how this thing was going to kill CMMC and stop it dead in its tracks? We've done 3 episodes now where we've gone through every recommendation, and I don't know what you're talking about, because where's the problem?
And even when they come up with solutions, it's not good enough.
Where's the problem in the 12-step process of authorizing C3PAOs, especially now post 32 CFR final rule, that we've taken stuff from this IG report and beefed up the training, beefed up the processes, beefed up the paperwork, filled in the gaps for the paperwork that was missing for the AB. Where's the controversy exactly? This is all pretty run-of-the-mill stuff that would fall through the cracks in a process like this, especially when you did it before the rule was even done. So I don't know. We're going to talk about, I think, our own personal thoughts on what's going on in the next episode, because there were some interesting allegations that were submitted to the IG that they looked at separately from their own audit of the process. Spoiler alert, those were also nothing burgers. But I'm pretty disappointed. This is not the IG's best work. This is not the IG's best work. But maybe we've been looking at it for too long. Maybe we've been staring at the report for too long. I know I have. So let us know in chat, in the comments. Did we miss something? Are we not seeing something? Did I miss a page in this report? Where's the problem?
I think if you think this one's spicy, Jacob has quite a few he'd like to show to you.
Oh boy, do we. Oh boy, do we. In fact, there was actually just an IT report that came out last week that I cannot wait to talk about, talking about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in defense critical infrastructure systems. That was actually a declassified report. It wasn't even originally a CUI report. Boy, oh boy, is it spicy. So you guys tell me, were you convinced after going through the analysis of the report? Like, is this it? Is this the thing that's going to do it in? I don't think so, but maybe I'm wrong. Let us know, and then we'll work that into the show next week, and we'll follow on from there, and then we can finally talk about something else. See y'all next week.
See you next week.